you very much. Good evening, everybody. I'm Aaron Glass. I'm a professor of cultural anthropology and associate chair of research programs here at Bard Graduate Center. And on behalf of our director, Susan Weber, and my co-chair of academic programs, Deborah Krohn, I'm pleased to welcome you all tonight to the third and last of this spring's Leon Levy Foundation Lectures in Jewish Material Culture. Here at Bard Graduate Center, we study the we study the human past and cultural history through their material traces and the complex ways in which decorative arts, design, and material culture mediate our own relationships with the past in the present. Our students, faculty, staff, and research fellows do this work cognizant of our own location in time and space. We are situated in 3 landmarked buildings on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, in the heart of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape, 1 block away from the former site of Seneca Village, a community of African American and immigrant property owners who were forcibly relocated to create Central Park, in a neighborhood and a city long comprised of global migrants and refugees from war, violence, and economic dislocation. We gather to hear about Jewish material culture at a precarious moment in Jewish and in human history, a distressing time of ongoing war and fragile ceasefires in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon, not to mention Ukraine and elsewhere, a time of rising anti-Semitic and anti-Islamic and anti-immigrant sentiments, a time of global political realignments and persistent climate crisis, and a time of newly embattled calls for diversifying and decolonizing our academies, our museums, and our cultural institutions. We are also, tonight, on the cusp of Passover, the key moment in the annual ritual cycle in which Jewish families gather to recall the exodus from Egypt and to reflect on a shared history of exile and resilience. It is precisely at such times that insights from the collective past, the material traces of prodigious learning, insight, and creativity, are called upon to help guide us out of our current predicaments into a common human future. As we'll hear tonight, museums can be key sites for mobilizing objects from the past in order to secure collective memories in the present, to heal historical traumas, and to imagine possible futures. In this spirit, we are grateful to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this lecture series in Jewish material culture, which over the past 8 years has supported distinguished scholars to give 3 related lectures, and then to publish with us on topics related to Jewish households, diasporas, and archaeologies, ranging from the Roman Empire through the medieval Islamic world to 19th century New York and 20th century Warsaw and Israel. In these varied contexts, I'm extremely honored to introduce again tonight's distinguished speaker, Dr. Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, known efficiently and affectionately by her friends, colleagues, and students as BKG. She is Professor Emerita of Performance Studies at New York University, celebrated for her eclectic work in Jewish studies, museum studies, folklore, tourism and heritage studies, and food studies. In previous posts at UT Austin, Columbia, and UPenn, she taught in departments such as folklore and anthropology, English lit and linguistics, and Yiddish and Judaic studies. A prodigious scholar, a recipient of countless awards and fellowships, a beloved colleague and mentor, a fixture on global editorial boards and advisory committees, and an internationally recognized museum consultant, she is currently the Ronald S. Lauder Chief Curator of the core exhibition at POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw, which has been the subject of her lectures here. I offered a longer personal account of Barbara's scholarship in my introduction to her first lecture, which you'll be able to watch on our website soon along with the other 2. For now, I mention only a few book titles to suggest the range of her output. Anne Frank, Unbound, Media, Imagination, and Memory, Destination Culture, Tourism, Museums, and Heritage, The Art of Being Jewish in Modern Times, Museum Frictions, Public Culture's Global Transformations, and They Call Me Meyer July, Painted Memories of a Jewish Childhood in Poland Before the Holocaust, which is directly relevant to her talk tonight. The title of her 3-part Levy Lecture series is Materializing History, the Making of POLIN Museum's Core Exhibition. And without further ado, we will hear the final installment, The Post-Jewish Object. Please join me in welcoming BKG back to BGC.
Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you also to Deborah and to Andrew for supporting, well, for inviting me and for supporting this lecture series. Tonight, I'm going to move from the core exhibition to a temporary exhibition, but they are very, very intimately related. And let me begin by saying that we just celebrated our 10th anniversary in 2024. And it's hard to believe that 10 years has passed since the grand opening of POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. Some of you were not here for the earlier lectures, so I want to just very, very briefly orient you to where we are located, and to do so in a way that's very specific to tonight's topic. And that is, we're located literally on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto and the former Jewish neighborhood in Warsaw that was the largest Jewish community in Europe before the war. And after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943, they leveled this area and it became an ocean of rubble. And I find this a very, very resonant image, an image of what I would call a post genocidal landscape. And in many ways, Poland today bears the traces of this landscape, not in as radical a form as you see it here, but the memory of that landscape and the traces of it are, if you will, hidden in plain view. And that is going to be very relevant to my talk tonight. And on the fifth anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the monument to the Ghetto Heroes was unveiled on the rubble of the ghetto. Now, you will find probably on your seat or nearby a little yellow daffodil. And if you open it like this, it will turn into a flower. And the POLIN Museum every year commemorates the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising on April 19th, which is the day that it broke out. And because we are a site specific museum, we are located on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto at the very place where the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising broke out, and we face the monument to the Warsaw Ghetto Heroes. And so we wear this yellow daffodil, we distribute them in Warsaw, throughout Poland, and elsewhere, and we tell the story of the bravery, the courage, and the tragedy of the Warsaw Ghetto and of the plight of the 3 million Polish Jews that were murdered during the Holocaust. So on April 19th, if you would wear this, we ask to take a selfie, post it on Instagram, help us to put out the word. But also, there will be a commemoration at what's called the Stone in Riverside Park, which is where every year there is a commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Until POLIN Museum opened, and they opened the building in 2013, and we had the grand opening with the core exhibition in 2014. And until then, because everything had been leveled, there was really almost no trace of what had been there before, except there was the Warsaw Ghetto Monument. And that monument became a kind of icon. It was, if you came to Warsaw and you wanted in some way to commemorate the pre-war Jewish community and what had happened to them during the Holocaust, the place that you went was to the monument. Heads of state went to the monument. Delegations went to the monument. And the monument and all that it represented had completely overshadowed the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. And so, with the opening of the Holocaust Museum in Washington in 1993, Regina Pawlak, who was with the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland, had attended the opening, and she came back to Warsaw and she said, if there's a Holocaust museum in Washington, there should be a museum of the history of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And so this began as a project of this, I would say, essentially a benevolent NGO in Poland, the association, and they carried this project and created the museum from the inside out. The museum was founded in 2005. There was an international competition for the building, and you can see here how it stands in relationship to the monument. We go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died. We come to the museum to honor them by remembering how they lived. Tonight, the story begins in 1967, when, quite by chance, I discovered that I was living with my very extraordinary parents. I call them extraordinary, ordinary people, because my father was born in 1916 in Opatów Apt in south central Poland, and he left in 1934 for Canada. He was 17. He had 7 grades of Polish public school. He was the first generation to go to Polish public school. And he had an extraordinary memory. And growing up, I knew he was curious. I knew he loved to explain things to me, all kinds of things. How you make a suspension bridge, how you make babies. He, I remember his line was, "The womb is a pear-shaped object." This was how he began an explanation how you make babies. So I remember conversations with him about, he said to me, "Do you know how the stock market works?" I don't know, I was 12, 13 years old. Now I do. So I would say it was a kind of a revelation during the Thanksgiving break when I came home from Indiana University. I was in the PhD program in folklore, and I was reading a Russian folklore book, Soviet era, because there was nothing else. This was 1967. And I remember reading a passage from the section on death, and he said to me, I was just, Sunday morning, sitting at the table, he's reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee, and he said, "Oh, we used to do that." And I said, "Really? And what else did you used to do?" And that became the beginning of a conversation that lasted for 40 years. And I recorded those conversations because, trained as a folklorist, an anthropologist, an ethnographer, any conversation worth having is worth recording. So I recorded those conversations. And I like to think David Isay said something to me once that I think captures this incredible relationship, as did the work of Barbara Meyerhoff. I don't know if you know her, as a wonderful anthropologist. But basically, what David Isay, and if you know StoryCorps, he is he's a radio documentarian, and he's an audio guy, which I really relate to. And he said, it's listening with love. And listening with love is the key to how this long saga that I will share with you really began, and it is how it was sustained for 40 years. Now, when I would be interviewing my father, I had a notebook. And whenever I didn't understand something, for example, he wanted to explain to me, how do you put out a fire in his town? So they had a kind of a little thing that would hold a certain amount of water, and they would take it to the river and fill it up and then pump it to put out a fire. The building would have burned down by the time they had come back from the river. But in any event, I didn't understand the mechanism. So, and he was like a living, walking Popular Mechanics. If those of you who remember, I think some of you will remember Popular Mechanics. Others would probably today would go to YouTube. But be that as it may, he would then make me a diagram and he would show me. And and he knew that my favorite topic was the kitchen. So I would ask him umpteen questions about the kitchen. So finally he made me a drawing to show me where everything was and how everything worked. And he would do this in my notebook. So I knew that he had a very visual memory. And he was a house painter, and then eventually a painting contractor, and eventually had his own paint, wallpaper, and floor covering store. So, he understood color and he understood paint, but he had no formal training whatsoever. And he retired at the age of 59 because he got sick and then he got better. But he was worried that he might get sick again and my mother would be stuck with the business, so he retired. But he did get better, and he was now a relatively young retiree with nothing to do. And he somehow languished. And so I had the thought, he could paint what he remembers. He could paint. And my mother was always a great champion, so she stayed on his case. My husband's an artist. He stayed on his case. And after about 10 years of filling up a closet with gifts to him of every art supply on the planet, he finally began to paint. And so his the so basically the real starting point of the exhibition and the whole concept of the post-Jewish object that I want to talk about tonight, it really starts here. And it starts with his memories, but they're linked to the storytelling. And the wonderful thing from my point of view is that the paintings and the stories that he tells are complementary. The stories are not captions to the paintings are not illustrations, but this is rather a kind of storytelling that is where the image or the visualization and the words are complementary to one another and they complete one another. Later, if you're interested, I will give you the whole story of on this painting, but I will in brief say this. He starts with the hat and he ends up with the shoes. So Jewish boys wouldn't wear that hat because it had stitches on the top and it formed a cross. And then it was the Slovatsky collar from the 19th century Romantic Polish poet, and the blue blazer, and the plus fours, and two pairs of white socks, and the red ski boots with the brass eyelets and the yellow shoelaces. And a whole story about every single element. But what about the herring? He calls this painting Boy with a Herring. What's with the herring? So the story with the herring is that his mother sent him to get a herring, and he went to his grandmother who had a little shop, and that newspapers were so precious that you wouldn't wrap it in a newspaper. There was one newspaper would be shared by several families. So then the newspaper, the his grandmother would cut a small piece of the newspaper as a handhold, and he would carry it like this, and the brine would drip from the head and from the tail, and he would taste the brine, and he'd bring it home, and his mother would make, and this all of this is his story that he's telling through this painting, that his mother would make something called a katzborscht, a scratch borscht, and she told him, you got to get a male herring. Why a male herring? Because, and I had no idea that this is a thing, you take a male herring, you open it up, you clean it out, but you save the milt, which is the sperm sac. And she would open up the sperm sac, she would scrape out the sperm, and then she would make a sauce with a little bit of water, a little bit of vinegar, a little bit of sugar, put it in a dish, cut up the herring, some chunks of bread, and that was a meal. That was like supper for everybody. And, I got asked about it by the forward, and I started to look into it, and it turns out it really is a delicacy. And in any event, so that's the boy with the herring. Now, if you can imagine, I mean, there isn't. My father always said that every painting there's a story, at least one, if not several. Now, the wonderful thing about Apatov is that it was a town, not a village. It was a town, and um, and as a town, it meant that it was laid out according to German town law. It had a central square. It had it had shops along it. The better masonry buildings were on the square. The poorer buildings were on streets on all sides, and then it kind of got chaotic. It was big enough to be interesting and small enough that he could wander around, and he was so unbelievably curious, and also it was transparent. It was The windows were open, the doors were open, people were working in their courtyards, they were working in front of their houses. He could watch the upholsterer, he could go to the blacksmith and work the bellows, he could watch the brush makers, he could watch the cooper, the rope maker, his friend's father blowing up the cow bladders. He was fascinated by everything, and he watched everything, and he remembered everything. And I think that a key to his, I call him, let me put it this way, I call him extrospective. Why? So I remember when we got a book award, and I said to him, listen, you're going to have to say something when you get the award. He said, what am I going to say? I says, well, why don't you tell them how you feel about getting the award? He says, feel? So out of the question. So introspection's not his thing, but extrospection, knowing himself through the way in which he relates to the material world, to the physical world, to the world around him, that's his thing. So this for us is a very important painting, and you'll see that it becomes a kind of a metaphor for the whole exhibition that I'll tell you about. And that is, he loved to run around the town with a hoop. And he ran everywhere, and his mother wasn't worried about him. His mother wasn't worried that he'll get it. Well, she was worried that he'll get into trouble, but not that anybody will hurt him or harm him. So this town became his, I would say, much more interesting for him than school. In fact, when we were working on our book together, he was supposed to be 14 when he finished primary school, and he was 15. And I said to him, "Well, what happened?" He said, "I failed a year." I said, "What do you mean you failed a year?" He said, "Well, I played hooky." I said, "What do you mean you played hooky? I mean, this is inconceivable." He said, "Well, how do you think I know all about the cooper, the blacksmith, the tailor, the shoemaker, and all the rest of it?" It was much more interesting to be wandering around the town. The town was his school, and the town became his memory palace. And he literally, his memory, I would say there were maybe three main vectors to his memory. One was in his mind's eye, he could walk around the town and he could remember building by building by building by building. Or he could remember a process. He could remember how it starts, and he even did a painting on how to make a brush with every single step from the delivery of the horsehair to the shellacking of the wood, every single step. And then the other was a wonderful feeling for local characters and stories. So narrative. That was, I would say, those are kind of the three kind of memory vectors. Now, I said to him, "I don't know where anything is. You tell me that it's on this corner and it's at the bottom of that street." So he made me a panorama of the town. And interestingly, it's like the panoramas of the 18th and 17th century, which is to say that north is on the bottom and south is on the top. So west is on the right and east is on the left. And it's a panorama that is conceptual, not visual. So all the important buildings are there, more or less in a relationship, but it's not a skyline. So he delivered the panorama. But I was still confused. So I made him a list of over 70 locations that he had been telling me about, and I had no idea where they were. I said, "Make me a map." And he did. And so, and colleagues and friends and relatives who've gone to the town to visit have used this map to try to navigate and to figure out where everything is. So my mother, basically campaigning him, I mean, relentlessly, she said to him, finally, she said, "Look," she said, "do the kitchen, paint the kitchen. Do it for Barbara. She'll use it in her work." So he did. And on his 50th wedding anniversary, he arrived at the party that my sister and I catered ourselves. And he brought this painting and he put it on the easel, and he couldn't believe what he had done. And so he continued. He continued to paint. This is one of my absolute favorite, the Pisher. So he explained that they had an outhouse, but in the winter, everything, even in the summer, the shutters were bolted and the door was bolted. And in the winter, the idea of undoing the door and going out to the outhouse, no way. So basically, and it's a very, very wonderful painting, two rooms, four sons, two parents, and a nanny, a maid, who had actually been the nursemaid to his mother and came back and said, "I'd like to be a nursemaid. I'd like to be a nanny to your kids." So um, stories, characters. Um, he said that the richest man in town had a lovely wife, impeccably dressed, beautiful, lovely woman, but she had a flaw. What was her flaw? She was a kleptomaniac. So he said, on Thursday, when the fish people would come with their barrels of fish, they would bring them and their holes in the barrel. They'd have them in the river, and they'd bring them and they would sell them, obviously, to Jews for Friday evening and for Catholics for Friday. He said she'd steal a fish and she would slip it down her bosom, which I think to myself, I can't, really, uh, but that's what he said. And there she is, dressed in that lovely little brown outfit with a little brown hat. Now, what I find so interesting is that how in this Jewish world do you deal with somebody who has a problem? Her husband told all the shopkeepers, "Let her steal. Don't bother her. On Monday morning, you come to me with a list of everything she stole, and I'll pay you." And that's pretty ingenious. That's pretty good. I don't know that, in our day and age, you get away with it, but nonetheless. Or because his father had a little shop where he sold leather goods and findings for shoemakers. So he, I have my sister when we were preparing the book, and I had several pages on how to make a shoe. My sister said her eyes glazed over, and she said, "You can't put that in the book. You can't have pages and pages and pages on how to make a shoe." I said, "Oh yes, you can. Yes, you can." And so then my father told me that he was in the steam room at the local JCC, and there he had friends who were survivors, and one of them was a shoemaker. So he said to him, "Yankel," he says, "I described to my daughter how to make a shoe. You do this and this and this." And Yankel said to him, "You know, Meyer, from your description, I would know how to make a shoe." So this is a story of a shoemaker with 7 daughters. They had their workshop and their home in basically 2 rooms. And every time a boy was born, the boy died. And the shoemaker was desperate. He went to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, Rabbi, I have 7 daughters. Every time a baby boy is born, he dies. What am I going to do? Who's going to say the prayer for the dead for me when I'm gone? How am I going to have dowries for the girls?" So the rabbi said, "Here's an amulet, let him wear it, and dress him in white. And so when the angel of death comes to get him, the angel of death will think he's already dead because he's wearing a white shroud, and he'll pass over him." And sure enough, the kid survived. The baby survived, and my father said that he was still wearing white when my father left in 1934, and he was still wearing white when the Jews of Apatov were deported to Treblinka. So it was so this painting he calls the white pajamas. Now, this is a synagogue interior. I did not realize until working on the post-Jewish exhibition, I did not realize that there is no documentation at all of any kind of the painted interior of the 500-year-old masonry synagogue in my father's town. There is no documentation at all. This is the only documentation, is what he remembered and painted. And that, I think, is I always loved this painting and I loved all the detail. And of course, he explains everything that's in the painting, but I had no idea that it had enormous historical value. Of course, he was always looking for topics. So some of them came very spontaneously. And then sometimes he'd call me up and say, "What am I going to paint?" So we'd make a list. And then he'd call me and he'd say, "Well, okay, what else is on the list?" And so he went through the life cycle, he went through the holidays. And as those of you who are familiar with Jewish self-taught artists, this is very often the way in which they actually organize their memories. They do it through life cycle, through the calendar year. And this is a wonderful painting in the Best Medrash, the house of study and prayer, not the synagogue, for Simchas Torah. For Purim, the Purim play, and this is a wonderful painting called The Krakow Wedding, which is was the favorite Purim folk play in Opatov, where it's all laborers, men, dressed up as women in what they think of as Krakow region costumes. And of course, he has many stories to tell about this couple and the child that they adopted from a family that had many children. They couldn't have a child, so they said, "Well, how about we raise one of them?" And they said, "Okay." And of course, the contact was made with the birth parents. The hunchback's wedding, they noticed that not only did she have a bump on her back, but she had a bump in the front. And so basically, in brief, I mean, these stories really shouldn't be told in kind of like the 2-second version because they're such beautiful stories. But in any event, her parents noticed one day and said to her, who, as my father would say, "Who did the dastardly deed?" And they found the guy and they begged them, they pleaded with them. And my father would say, "Well, isn't it bad that she was born with this deformity? Did you also have to make her pregnant? And, marry her. She's a good woman. She'll be a good mother. She'll be a good housewife. And we'll set you up in a tailor business and you'll have it made for life." And no, 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 no. Finally, he relented. And no sooner did they break the glass, they rushed her into the next room and she gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. So that was and there's a whole story here with the red chair, but we'll save that for another time. Also, the memorial book turned out to be a wonderful trigger for memory. Not only that it inspired him to remember um, what he had himself experienced, but there were stories there that he didn't experience that were from the 1890s or that were from an earlier period. And one of them was the Black Wedding, which was a way to avert a cholera epidemic in the 1890s. And actually, during COVID, the Black Wedding was actually performed in Bnei Brak in Israel among ultra Orthodox Jews. So, this custom of doing the greatest mitzvah, the greatest righteous deed, which is to take two unmarriageable people and to marry them, and for the community to get them set up to start their lives by making a gift of money and doing so in the cemetery and beseeching the dead to intervene with the Lord on behalf of the living. So this is a story that he read. He left in 1934. It was for economic reasons and came to Canada. But those of his family that remained in Poland were, of course, they perished in the Holocaust. And this particular painting is especially meaningful. It's the fate of my father's father's family, and that is they lived in a smaller town called Ilja or Drilj in Yiddish, and there was a ghetto there. And what happened was in the spring and the summer and the early fall, the men in the family snuck out of the ghetto and hid in the forest with the partisans. But once winter came and there was snow, they snuck back into the ghetto. Somebody snitched on them, and the Germans found out, and they lashed my father's grandmother to a tree, lined up all of the children that were still there, their wives and their children, shot them before her eyes, and then shot her. And my father learned of this, of course, from letters that came and then from survivors right after the war. But he couldn't bring himself to paint what he could visualize until we were at the Prado. And my husband took him up to see Goya's Disasters of War. And when he saw the painting, he said, I know exactly what to do. So this is where the story starts. Now, I went back to Poland for the first time in 1980, 81, and I wanted my father to come with me, and he wouldn't. But over time, he warmed to the idea and then went with me several times. And in 2008, we had a very extraordinary experience, and that was that the town wanted to exhibit his paintings. And this was a result of a relationship he had formed with a young man on earlier trips. And so I just want to give you a sense of how the town received him and how the town received his memories and his paintings. So, first of all, posters for the exhibition were everywhere. They were at the bus stop. They were on the front of the county seat, and the title that the community gave the exhibition was Stare Opatów, Old Opatów, not Jewish Opatów, not Old Jewish Opatów, Old Opatów, because the town today is about 7,000 people. Only about 10 families have a pre-war history in the town, and so there is virtually no memory of pre-war Opatów. There is no memory. And the town before the war was about 9,000 people, and about 6,000 were Jews, which was quite typical. And there were big posters on the swoops on these columns throughout the town. And the young man on the left became the champion of my father after he met him for the first time in 1995. And so they made the exhibition. And of course, I couldn't offer them the original paintings, but we offered them digital files. And my colleagues went 2 weeks earlier to see the exhibition, and they warned me. They said, Barbara, it's not going to be MoMA. It's not going to be, Soho. We just want to warn you. So what was it? It was blue and white organza, potted palms. And I said, this is their exhibition. And this really is an expression of the value and how special they feel this is. And I accept it completely, totally. And it was so unbelievably warmly received. Unbelievable. But then there was a surprise. There was a surprise. And that was after the opening, the ribbon cutting and the ceremony and everything else, there was a reception. And everything was taking place in the local museum of geodesy, which means basically geological survey. So they have all this equipment from 20, 50, 70, 80 years ago that's broken and you can't do anything with it, make a museum. So they have a museum of geological survey, basically, is what they've got. And here I see these showcases, and they're full of Judaica. And I'm thinking to myself, what is this? What's going on? On the one hand, so I remember asking our host, the director of this museum, this little museum, and I said, "Oh my God, where do these come from?" He said, "There are collectors in the town." I said, "Collectors of Judaica?" He said, "Yes, there are three." "Oh," I said, "I want to meet them." So then in Polish, because at the time I didn't understand Polish, now I would, he said to the filmmaker we were with, "Can you tell her diplomatically that they don't want to be known?" So I could never, I said, I wanted to meet them. I wanted to know, where did they find the objects? Why were they collecting them? And then I also said, "Are there any Jews in the town?" He said he couldn't say. And I think what that means is there very well might be someone, but they're very sensitive and discreet about talking about anything like that, and certainly not to strangers and not in public. So, in a way, I was very naive. I was really naive in seeing these objects. But as you will see going forward, today I've come to understand them as the quintessence of a post Jewish object. They are the quintessence. And I'm going to try to show you where the term comes from and how we're using it, why we're using it. So let me just do a little detour. And here I have to offer my warmest, deepest gratitude to Aviva Weintraub, who's here in the audience, because it's thanks to her that my father had an exhibition of his paintings at the Jewish Museum. And that would have been in 2008, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a wonderful exhibition. But it was the kind of exhibition, but much better than we had done at other places. We had in smaller venues with fewer resources. And the season of the exhibition was May, because my father, his best friend, used to say, "We waited for May like for the Messiah." And so this was, and the dew on the grass in the early morning was something they very, very fondly remembered. And so it was a very beautiful, lyrical exhibition, and the way which it was organized and installed, it really was a kind of curatorial tour de force. It was absolutely, absolutely beautiful. And of course, it ended with the two endings, that is to say, the emigration story and the Holocaust story. And then with a very analog table where we encouraged people to make drawings and comments and tell their stories. And that was basically it. It was a success. Roberta Smith gave it a review in the New York Times. It was very positively reviewed. However, we had the opportunity to create an exhibition inspired by my father's memories and paintings at POLIN Museum of the History of Polish Jews in Warsaw. And the wisest, the best decision that the head of our exhibition department, Ioana Fikus, the best decision she made was that she didn't ask me to curate it. It was the best possible decision, because I would have probably created an exhibition inspired by what Aviva and I had done at the Jewish Museum. And it would have been beautiful, and people would have loved it, and it would have been a big success, no question about it. But what Ioana did was she invited two young curators, and that was Natalia Romick and Justyna Kojarska-Schulz, two brilliant young curators with whom I had worked closely on the core exhibition, the dream team. I couldn't have asked for better, more imaginative, more thoughtful people. And they said that what we needed to do was essentially ask a question that we had never asked in the core exhibition and that had never been asked in relation to the exhibitions of my father's paintings. And that was, how did the shtetl become a post Jewish town? How did that happen? And I'm going to show you the origin of the term post Jewish in just a moment. How did that happen? Now, here I have to acknowledge that if you want to read something really interesting about the shtetl, I recommend Jeffrey Chandler's book on the shtetl. Brilliant book, and it's a very complicated, rich topic, and it would be a very good place to start. So the first I would say message that we worked with was that the Jewish town, which is what we call the shtetl within the core exhibition, that the Jewish town, why Jewish town? Because there were more than 1,000 towns in Poland where a substantial proportion of the population was Jewish. In my father's town, 60%, but in some towns, 70, 80, even 90%. And so those towns had a very particular character. They were the economic hub of these large, noble estates. And Jews were very, very important to the economy, not only of the town, but also of the rural economy all around the town. And so the nobility were really interested in having Jews run their taverns and manage assets on their estates, fisheries and forests and salt mines and whole villages. So the first thing was to establish that the Jewish town, or shtetl, to use the Yiddish word, was the most distinctive form of Jewish settlement in this region. And it is very specific to this region. And in fact, it is the town that my father remembers. And so we had a map, and the map shows you, if not all of the 1,000 places, almost. And here it shows you the percentages. And you can see that these percentages are really enormous. I mean, just try to imagine, of course you could if it were Muncie or New Square, in New York, but, try to imagine Philadelphia or Baltimore as 70% Jewish. I mean, it would be as if the Lower East Side was all of New York. So it's really, really hard to imagine what a place would be like, and not one place, but 1,000 places. So that was really our starting point, is the phenomenon itself. And what Justina and Natalia did was they said, what we want to do is to juxtapose the shtetl as remembered by my father, which is to say, a post-war remembering of a pre-war place, way of life, Jewish world, to juxtapose that with what happened to his town, not a synthesis. It's going to be a patuf all the way. What happened to that world that he remembers and that he painted? What happened to it during the Holocaust, and what happened to it after the Holocaust, and what is it today, and what does it mean to the people who are living there today? In other words, you could say that the genocide, the Holocaust, is hidden in plain view. It has, in a way, poisoned the Polish landscape from one perspective, and that these towns, in a way, they're living in this post-Jewish world, and we'll come to the term in just a second. So this is why the image that we started with, which is this, I would say, post-genocide landscape. And we invoke this post-genocide landscape when we enter the post-war gallery of the core exhibition. And we can see that people are looking through the rubble to see what they can find, and that for many of the Jews who left immediately, this post-genocidal landscape was a cemetery, and they didn't want to live in a cemetery. So but in the post-war gallery that we present in the core exhibition, we only look at the Jewish story. we never ask ourselves, and it's as if the Jewish story, and that the Jewish story is the only story, and that when the Jewish story of these towns ends, the story of these towns no longer becomes part of that story. And what they're saying is, but it is part of that story. It is, because it is that part of the story in this post-Jewish way. So, post-Jewish, finally. So, um, basically, okay, so what happened was that my father passed away in 2009, and I would never let him sell paintings. I said, we're not in it for the money, we're not in it for fame, for fortune, or for a career. This is an oeuvre, this is a corpus. I want to keep it all together, no selling. And of course, there were many people interested. I said, no, no selling. So now we had hundreds of paintings, drawings, and prints, and we needed to find a proper home for them. And POLIN Museum accepted the gift from my family of the entire oeuvre. And I had to find a gift that would support this gift because it's a costly enterprise to inventory and to crate and ship and then take care of and work with and use the collection. And then the museum decided, okay, we're going to do an exhibition, but it's not going to be like any way that this work has been exhibited before. It's going to be it's going to follow this concept that Natalia and Justina brought with them, which was this idea of from the shtetl to the post-Jewish town, working with the idea of post-Jewish, which had been an idea that Natalia had been working with in her artistic practice for more than 15 years, also in her scholarly practice as an historian. So she really had a very developed understanding of this idea. And so here's where it starts. It starts with geological survey. It starts with maps that are made in the mid 1940s, right after the war, to determine what's where. So this is a map that the geological surveyors made of the town, indicating what buildings are up, who do they belong to. And what you can see, and you should be able to see it even here in this bottom left corner, you see the word po-Żydowskie, post-Jewish. Now, in Poland, that word is completely understandable, absolutely transparent, and filled with anxiety. It's a nervous word. It's nervous. It's indeterminate. So, anywhere there's property that once belonged to Jews and is still standing, but the owner can't be found and his heirs can't be found, it is identified as not as Jewish, but as post-Jewish, and similarly with a vacant lot. So these maps have marked on them post-Jewish, 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 post-Jewish. Now, the word in English makes no sense whatsoever. And when it came to translate po-Żydowskie, we had no option. So I started looking to see, Oxford English Dictionary, somewhere is there any indication of it being used? And I did find it. I found it in the 1990s, where American Jewish historians were responding to postmodern, post-ethnic, post-this, post-that. Why not post-Jewish? Now, when they said post-Jewish, they never thought of property. I mean, look at all those synagogues on the Lower East Side. Once they were a church, then they were a synagogue, then they were a church. Do we say about the church that it's post-Jewish because it was a synagogue before it was a church? Never. Never. So it only, in the context that I saw it, it only ever refers to identity. So these are two terms from two different universes, and the English term bears no connection to the Polish term. Now, what exactly is going on, and why did we think to in a way, expand the idea of post-Jewish beyond property, meaning land, buildings, objects, to expand it to refer to a kind of new reality called the post-Jewish town, to the whole town. And in essence, first of all, the term only applies to objects that, in a sense, became what they became as a result of the Holocaust. And what does that mean? It means dispossession as a result of violence. That's what defines a post-Jewish object, and specifically the violence of the Holocaust. That's what it is. And then all of a sudden, when I look back on those showcases of Judaica in that geodesic museum, that was the kind of additional kind of supplement to to my father's paintings, I realize those are post-Jewish objects, and we don't know if any of them are from Apatov, and we do know that they were acquired at auctions and flea markets, and what were the motivations? If you can't talk to the collectors, who knows? However, in the process of creating the exhibition, the idea was to juxtapose the memories of the pre-war shtetl, as my father remembered it, with the post-war reality and the process by which the shtetl became a post-Jewish town. So, coming back to the idea of materializing history, and that is these two curators who are so unbelievably imaginative. They made multiple visits to Apatov, and they saw that there were wooden pre-war buildings that were dilapidated and about to be torn down. One of them was a pre-war school that had been attended by Jewish and Christian kids. And they said to the museum, they're going to demolish this building, buy it. So the museum bought the building, and they proceeded to dismember the building, salvage the wood, bring the wood to Warsaw, fumigate it, treat it, and fabricate the entire exhibition from the wood of this pre-war school, which is just totally genius. It's simply brilliant. So you are, you just the materiality, the tangibility of this wood, I think, is really the making of the exhibition. They also use their charm offensive in getting a collector in the town to show them his collection. He has several story house filled with his collection, and he has an enormous collection of Judaica, and much of it from Apatov. And he eventually agreed to allow us to borrow objects from his collection, including the candlesticks. And so we have one showcase of these post-Jewish objects, not all of them from his collection, but among the ones that I found, and that we all found very, very moving, are these wooden menorahs and wooden Hanukkah lamps. There's a 7-branch one and an 8-branch plus the shamas. And we speculated, and I think we're on the right track, that when the Germans basically occupied the town, they confiscated anything that was valuable. They confiscated silver, they confiscated anything of value. And so when it came to the Jewish holidays, what were Jews going to use? And so some of them obviously carved from wood a Hanukkah lamp. And we know, for example, this is one that was carved into Reisenstadt. So the idea of actually using wood and carving these ceremonial objects under these circumstances, we know this from other sources. So what happened to the synagogue? And this, of course, is the exterior, one of the earliest paintings he did, and the interior, a different painting of the interior. So basically, it was very damaged during the war, but it was still standing well into the 50s. It was still standing. And then at a certain point, the local population decided to tear it down and recycle the material. And so all that's left is a little tiny chunk of a wall on a vacant lot. And nothing's been done to that vacant lot. Nothing has happened to it in the entire time since the war. What happened, and there are some small pieces from the candelabrum, from the synagogue that remained, And this photograph gives you an idea of what was in the synagogue. These are silver Torah crowns and also finials from a patuf that were lost in the Holocaust. This is a photograph that was taken before the war, and it's in a catalog of unknown Jewish silversmiths, a catalog of stolen and missing cultural achievements that was published, or it was made in 1988. And it was owned by the synagogue and lost between 1939 and 1944. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of what would have been in the synagogue. What about the cemetery? Well, if Jews are living in this town for 500 years, and there were 6,000 of them in the 1930s, there must have been tens of thousands of tombstones. And basically, all of them were removed. All of them. And they were used during the Holocaust to protect the banks of the river and to reroute the river. They were used, for example, to make retaining walls. They were used for flooring. They were used to make millstones. They were used in myriad ways. And one of the actions that local activists in the town, local historians who really care about the Jewish past, they proceeded over the last 20 years to gather remnants of these tombstones. They brought them together and they created a lapidarium, which they unveiled on the 80th anniversary of the deportation of the Jews from Apatov to Treblinka. What about the mikveh? What about the ritual bath? Now, everybody asks, my father observed everything. How did he know what Women's Day at the mikveh looked like? So I always say, well, he had a vivid imagination because he also did Men's Day. And so the mikveh was a combination of a steam bath and local bath because people didn't have really adequate bathing facilities at home. They didn't have running water. So they would go to the bathhouse, which was also a mikveh. What happened was that this building is still standing. And right after the war, it became a candy factory. And it produced a candy that my father remembers from before the war, krufki, which mean little cows. And basically it's milk fudge or milk caramels in a little white wrapper. And he describes it. He remembers it vividly. They had a little cow on it with black and white markings. And they do that to this day. And they still wrap them by hand. And the table where the women are wrapping them by hand is literally right over the basin of the mikveh, which is beneath the ground, and today it's inaccessible. So I'm going to conclude with the exhibition itself to show you how we worked with the idea of post-Jewish and how we worked with the paintings. So first of all, we exhibited the paintings by lining the perimeter of the gallery with them, taking our inspiration from the hoop, so that the visitor is encircled with images, memories, paintings of what my father remembered about the town before the war. And that kind of, I would say, it's a kind of a very warm circle because overall, it's the memories of a child, memories of a boy, somebody who didn't have the responsibilities of an adult, who didn't have to worry about making a living, about taking care of children, about all the things that adults have to take care of. He really, in that way, had a memory that was not colored by the direct trauma of the Holocaust, and it was also a memory that was not shaped by the responsibilities of an adult. So it's a very, very particular kind of a gift to have that way of remembering. And so that's the perimeter. And then what we did is we created a showcase for the post-Jewish objects, largely from the collection of Jerzy Brzydkowski. And we then, on these, we created a series of freestanding wooden frames. On one side is pre-war shtetl, on the other side is post-Jewish town. And we did that in a variety of really, really interesting ways. And so one of the gifts of the exhibition is that it was accessible to kids and very young children who had their own little audio device. And so, on the one hand, people were very moved by the paintings. Those who were interested in the more difficult history would explore the frames. There were multiple points of entry, and it was very much, I would say, a multi-generational experience, and it was very warmly received. There were 108,000 visitors to this exhibition. And one of the questions that I ask is why? Why? And the majority of them were Polish visitors. Why was the response by Polish visitors to this exhibition so enthusiastic, so moving, so intense? Nothing without any comparison to anywhere else we've shown the paintings, and we've had great responses elsewhere. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. We published a catalog in Polish and English. We published a Polish translation of my father's memories and paintings. And then the Radio Opatów, not that it has huge circulation, but nonetheless, Radio Opatów, every Saturday they had a professional lector, reader, read a passage from the Polish translation of his memoir, which I think is incredible. And then the museum went ahead and took the memorial book, which had been published in 1966, and they translated it completely from Hebrew and Yiddish into Polish. So, and then in Poland, they just had a book launch in Opatów, and they brought those who were responsible for the translation, and they had a whole discussion of it. In the week that followed, the museum's Museum on Wheels went to Opatów. And it turns out what the town did was and together with POLIN Museum, they took characters from my father's paintings, made them life-size, and they put them up around the town in the places where he said he remembered them. I mean, more or less. And then one of the local historians, who's a great advocate and a great activist for the Jewish memory of the town, she gave guided tours based on this lovely device. And the idea that if you know where to look, you'll see these traces, these material traces. And one of them is the cavity where there was once a mezuzah and now there's just a cavity. And these are Polish kids who are learning to look for and see some of these traces that are hidden in plain sight. Of course, my family came, and Darek, who is on the right, is the man who, from 1995, formed this extraordinary relationship with my father and was his great championship and put him up to be honorary citizen of Opatów. And when I told my father this, he said to me, "What do you mean honorary citizen? I'm already a citizen." So I said to him, "Well, it's something extra." So, and this was, let's see, how many generations? Me, my nieces, so it would be three generations. And then I want to end with this. I want to end with Goldman's cookie. So somehow or other, I know what happened. So this wonderful woman, Maria Bajewska, she created something she called a half guide to Jewish Opatów, meaning that it's like a little guide. And she organized it from A to Z. And when she got to G, she devoted G to Goldman's cookie. And I thought, what is that? What do you mean Goldman's cookie? So I followed it up. And what did I discover? I discovered Justina, this wonderful woman whose great grandmother had lived in Opatów for a couple of, I actually think 2 decades before the war, was a public school teacher. And she had a school notebook in which she wrote down recipes. And one of the recipes she wrote down was for a cookie, Goldman's cookie. And Goldman was a baker. And it turns out that actually there are cookies in this manuscript notebook from 4 Jewish bakers. So Justina proceeded to bake these cookies, and she decided that she wanted to restore Baker Goldman's first name. So she went into the city archive to find him, and she found him, and his first name is Abraham. So it's Abraham Goldman's cookie. And what she told me is that every Christmas, her family bakes Goldman's cookie and remembers the Jews of Opatów. So I think that, from my point of view, It's the perfect way to end.
We have time for some questions.
I've got a question up. Okay, he's got it.
Oh.
But then in Warsaw, right? I'm just wondering how the Polish community responded to the resurrection of this history that
Do you
had been
mean
erased.
responding to the exhibition at POLIN Museum or in Apatos?
The museum where you took the wood from the house and then you had these kind of diptychs where
Oh,
on
yeah,
one
yeah, yeah.
side you had the picture of
Okay.
your father, and then
Okay, thank you for asking. So I asked a question, but I didn't answer it. And I've been giving it a lot of thought. Why? Because, first of all, the media picked this exhibition up and we got incredible media coverage. And there is a website, a blog actually, called Ładne Bebe, Beautiful Baby. And they brought mothers and young children to the exhibition. Actually, some of those images of the children are from Ładne Bebe. And they then wrote up the visit. And it began this way. It began 5 times yes. 5 reasons why you must bring your children to this exhibition. And we're talking 5 years old, 4 years old, 6 years old. We're talking small children. And there were many reasons. It's a great place to go on Children's Day and, whatever. But there was one reason that was for me a shock. And it said, our children do not need to have their histories sugar-coated. They need the truth. This exhibition tells them the truth. And I thought, oh my word. And we're talking young, very, very young children. So that was one response. There were other responses where people were so deeply moved, so emotional. And I think first and foremost, probably to the paintings. The paintings were very beautifully installed because we are very conscious of disability access and wheelchairs and the height of everything and how things are illuminated, and the size of the font and contrast, etc. But we had a very deep aubergine kind of walls that were kind of warm, but not like a white cube, and not black, kind of sad, and not gray neutral. But it was a very unusual choice. The paintings were very beautifully lit. The stories, the texts for the paintings were only my father's stories, no curatorial comment at all. And I sort of, in thinking about it, I was thinking to myself that, well, my first thought is this. A principle that I like to think we work with at the museum is the principle of constructive engagement. That is, rather than berating our Polish visitors with all that went wrong and any role that Polish society might have played in the Holocaust or in relation to their neighbors, rather than go that route, to start from a different place, to start from a position of trust, to start from the idea that this generation born after the war is not responsible for what happened, but they are responsible for what they do with what they know about what happened. And so, if we start from this position of constructive engagement, I would say that that is fundamental to the starting point for the exhibition. So that means that, in a way, they've entered a safe space. They've entered a space of trust. And in a space of trust, there is a greater openness to confronting very, very difficult issues. So that would be the first point. The second is that it was for many of our visitors a revelation. It was a kind of a vista on an absolute on a world that they had absolutely no knowledge of, and if they had any knowledge of it, it was only the Holocaust, and they had no way of visualizing it. Now, maybe some of them had read literature, it's hard to say, but there was the feeling of a revelation that all of a sudden, in living color, not black and white photographs, but in living color, and in these very, I would say, communicative stories, they were entering a world that had been completely inaccessible to them. Then I would say you go from there to a profound sense of loss, that something valuable had been lost, irretrievably lost, and lost as a result of unimaginable violence. And these are people that are living in the places where it happened. So the way, I don't know that those who came to visit the exhibition thought in this way, but the way that I think of it is this. I was born on September 30th, 1942. And a month later, October, 3 weeks later, October 22nd, the Jews of Apatov were deported to Treblinka, and several hundred were forced to march to Sandomierz to a slave labor camp. If you could imagine that overnight, literally, whether it was 36 hours, 48 hours, but let's say overnight, 60% of the town vanishes. Literally overnight, they vanish. The tea is still on the table. All of their possessions are in their apartments. Whatever inventory they have in their shops are still there. And they're gone. And all that's left is their property. So the Germans had their own system for dealing with the property, and they enlisted the local Polish population in assisting them in sorting it and what to send to Germany and what to sell and what to give to those who helped them, etc. But over time, basically, all that property, where the 60% of the town was living, it's all post-Jewish property. Now, post-Jewish, it's not like post-genocide. Post-genocide means the genocide's over. Post-Jewish, the Jewish is not over. It's not over. There's always the risk that an heir might turn up, and that even though the property was transferred as legally as was possible based on certain protocols in the post-war period, but even if it's not a question of an heir turning up, there's the sense that this post-Jewish property that the Jewish piece of it will never go away. That the violence that resulted in to put it in a very painful way, it's to be the beneficiary of somebody else's tragedy, and a tragedy for which you are not personally responsible. Sure, I don't know what I would have done under such circumstances. They don't know, or you don't know what anybody would have done under such circumstances. But the idea that this town is what it is as a result of this violence, and that whatever it is that remains now lives on in the absence of those who were once living there. And I think there's something incredibly profound in that realization, but to realize it in this exhibition, which is, I would say, so thoughtful and sensitive, and has I think there are people that would have expected that it would have been an exhibition about anti-Semitism, full stop. And they're just really surprised that it puts together this pre-war world as remembered by somebody who grew up there, by a Jewish boy who grew up there, with the process by which it became the place in which they live today. And what it is, it's a call to action. That's what it is. And we had wanted to produce a kind of guide to heritage that is tangible, intangible heritage in these towns, especially wooden architecture. because a lot of this wooden architecture is just left to fall apart. And so the idea was that if we could draw attention to what does remain and to encourage the local history enthusiasts, lovers of the region, lovers of the town, and the advocates for the Jewish past of the town to actually identify and take care of what does remain and to, in a sense, nurture that memory, the worst of it and the best of it, that the exhibition could serve as a call for action. That's how I put it.
Question right here. Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask you, you showed objects, Judaica objects in Opatuv that you had discovered there, and then how you inquired about the source of the Judaic objects, and they had said there's 3 collectors, but they were reluctant to disclose the names. Did you ever meet or discover who these local Judaic collectors were?
You're right. So the 3 who had contributed objects that were in these vitrines, which even the way they were shown, was like a junk shop. I mean, even though the thing is, what was so difficult for me is that I knew that those collectors were well intentioned. I knew they meant well. I knew they were well intentioned. But I didn't know what to make of it. It was strange that they were collecting these. It was strange the way they were being shown. They were haunted. It was very strange. But now, in preparing for the exhibition, there is one collector. He is like the Uber collector. This man, Mr. Brzykowski, who, thanks to the charm of these 2 wonderful curators, he finally agreed to let us borrow objects. Now, how did he get them? Because I think that's the issue. So we were only interested in objects from Opatuv, where he was sure and he could verify and document. So, for instance, when a building's being demolished, he's the first one there asking the demolition crew, did you find anything in the attic? Did you find anything in the basement? And he's the first one to actually salvage the objects. If there's a fire, if there's any opportunity, plus, of course, I think also his father was collecting because some of these objects came right after the war. So he's the one. He's the one that we're fortunate enough that he would cooperate with us. We're really very grateful to him.
Great. Aaron. Your question here, and then
Thanks. Thank you, Barbara. I have a deceptively simple question. Who is the we that are here?
Oh, okay.
And I ask that thinking about indigenous post-genocide discourse in which we are still here is a key statement about survival. But here the we seems much more ambiguous. And I was looking at this while you were giving your answer to the question of why Poles came to this, and thinking about post-Jewish, not as after Jewish, but as like formerly Jewish or something. So who's the we in this statement?
So what's interesting is this is a quotation from Marian Tursky, and it's Mir Zenin Do. He's taking it from the Yiddish. And I'm going to ask Stuart Jeffrey, is it from the hymn? From the Partisaner hymn. So it's actually coming from the period of the Warsaw Ghetto and the uprising. So it's basically it's coming from there. And I think in this context, it's not that we're still here. I mean, I don't know, Jeff or Stuart, do you want to comment?
Why is it in English?
Well, no, actually, everywhere. No. You know what? This is a projection during an event, and they, it's like skywriting in 3 languages. In all of our materials, it's in all 3 languages. It's in Yiddish, it's in Polish, it's in English. And Marian was a Holocaust survivor. He survived Auschwitz, 2 death marches, Buchenwald, Theresienstadt. So I think Not we are still here. No way, right?
This is strategically ambiguous because is it we the museum? Is it we the visitors? Is it and in a way that's strategic of it's very inviting actually.
Yeah, it's actually very inclusive. It's and it's different from Anu, which means us. In the case of the Jewish Diaspora Museum, well, they call it now the Museum of the Jewish People, excuse me, the Museum of the Jewish People in Tel Aviv, Anu, where it's a more, I think, it refers specifically to us. Whereas I think I agree with you, it's much more open. Yeah.
Primarily is defiant.
Yes,
we are here
defiant.
despite your efforts to destroy us. We are here.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
I'm interested in the larger view of how the Polish people dealt with themselves after the war. They had a pope that came from Poland who was probably there all this time, right? So are they a little bit like the Germans feeling guilty, or do they absolve themselves, the older ones particularly, of we didn't know what was happening? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, I do. I do. I certainly do. Well, I would say this. First of all, I think that comparisons between the German and Polish situations, those comparisons are quite unfortunate. The genocide was a German project. The Germans occupied Poland. There was no Polish state. There was an underground state. There was a government in exile. And Poland, that is to say, there was a Polish resistance, a Polish underground. There was a Warsaw uprising, and from a Polish perspective, anything to get rid of the Germans and to restore Polish independence, that was the mission. There was the idea that they would be on, that they would want to make common cause with the Germans to murder all the Jews. No, they basically were occupied. So I think you have to start there. Then one of the things that we show in the exhibition is, and we show it in more than one place, is what we call a spectrum of relations. And I would say the Holocaust historians, especially those working in Poland, would say that if you had to do percentages of did more Jews help Jews, more Poles help Jews, or did more Poles hurt Jews? So the Holocaust historians would say the number of Poles who helped Jews was much smaller than the number of Poles who hurt Jews. But from a Polish perspective, it's the opposite. So the objection in terms of Polish historical policy, which under the right-wing government was to uphold the good name, defend the good name of Poland, it would be, oh, there were a few bad apples. Yes, there were some Poles who behaved badly, but overall, Poles were good to Jews. And we know that that historically is inaccurate. I would say there's a difference between the immediate post-war years. We have an exhibition right now, 1945, on the first 5 years after the end of the war. And it's a really difficult story. There's a lot of violence. The country was not completely demilitarized. It was very chaotic. So it's a really complicated story. But I think that what we do in this exhibition is really look at Polish society today and look at these towns today. And it's a whole new generation. I'm not saying that, it was interesting. When we were on our way to Opatów with my family, we wanted to stop by the mayor's office and talk to the mayor of Opatów and say to him that we wanted him to encourage school groups to come to the museum to see this exhibition. So he wasn't there. He was busy in Kielce or somewhere else. So they gave us the deputy mayor. And at first he was very defensive. And then as he listened to us, he said, "You're so positive." Because the assumption was that we were going to come there and accuse them and tell them how horribly they had treated Jews and that they were responsible for everything bad that happened. And when we explained that, it's not about is it good, is it bad? It's a nuanced, broader, complicated story, but that we didn't come to put a black stain on Apatov and point a finger and hold them, hold those who are living there now responsible. So I think we're dealing with an 80-year or longer period. And it's that period really, really evolved under communism, after communism, today. So it's complicated.
Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Hi, thank you again, Barbara, for a fascinating talk. Um, I'm living with this idea of post-Jewish equally being dispossession. It's like a gut punch, and very personal. Uh, so, and I'm thinking about the collectors that you were speaking about before. These three collectors, and why people collect things and objects. I don't think it's any coincidence that the word object is in objectification. I'm not sure what my question is. I just wanted to say that out loud.
Well, I hear a question, and that is, why are they collecting? And it's a good question. And actually, a number of scholars have been writing about it and working on this and interviewing collectors and looking not only in Poland but also in Belarus, because the phenomenon is much wider. And there are many motivations. I think for some, there's a genuine fascination with the Jewish past and a feeling that they can actually come much closer to it because of the material nature of these objects. That these objects are, I don't know, they're like metonyms, that in a way they're still attached to something that's lost. And their sheer durability, the objects survived. And they, for the most part, I think that the collectors don't know who they belong to. I mean, there are going to be exceptions, but I think for the most part they don't know. But some of them are just like collectors. I'm a collector, so and people collect all kinds of things. You can't always, like, matchboxes, buttons. They collect all kinds of things for God only knows what reason. Here, I think there's partly the collector's impulse. Like, for example, Brzydkowski. There was a wine company that made kosher wine, and for Passover, and they would make a very fancy bottle, and then they would make, I guess as a promotion, these little like beer mugs, glass, and it said Pesach on them. They were small for that wine, for the Seder. Now, why isn't one enough? 2, 5, 20, 80, 100? So, there'll be some categories where he's got a huge number of something, whether it's Kiddush cups or these little glass beakers, or it's, whatever it might be. So I would say some of it is just the collecting impulse. I mean, I don't want to say that it verges on hoarding, but because I've been thinking about that for a while. But very personal matter. But I would say that, but there's something about collecting, period. But then in this particular case, that he's collecting specifically from the town. I think these are proxies for people to some degree. I think there's that element is there. And also they are, if you will, the remnants of a lost world. I just think there's all kinds of resonances and a lot of emotion attached to it. And I think for some of them, they feel that they're doing a mitzvah, that they're actually salvaging, that they're taking care of this material heritage, that if they weren't there when the guy was tearing down the house and didn't salvage what he found in the attic, it would be in the trash bin. And actually, I found a tefillin, a little velvet bag. No, I didn't find it. My medieval historian from the exhibition She found it, and it was lying on a heap of trash on a street in Warsaw. And she picked it up and she gave it to me for the museum. And I thought, unbelievable. So I think in some ways this is a salvage operation.
Before we thank the great BKG, I do want to take a moment to thank you all. It was really remarkable to see a group of people come together again and again. It's no surprise that it was for her, but we were the beneficiaries. It was really important to us that you all came. We will do this series again in the spring next year, and I hope you'll join us. Also, our gallery is reopening in September. Thank goodness. I know you're all waiting. And we're also here every Wednesday at 6 p.m. with different programs, different amazing speakers. So if you want to learn more about BGC, my colleague Lindsay and I will be standing right outside. But really, truly, we're all here for one person, and it is the wonderful Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett.
Thank you.